I'm Pamela, 28 female. I work as a librarian in my hometown, a quiet place where most people are born, live, and are eventually laid to rest within the same 5-mile radius. For a decade, I believed this was my destiny, a fate sealed by a single, thin rejection letter from my dream university. Little did I know, the rejection was a lie, and the destiny I was living was a carefully constructed cage built by the two people I trusted most in the world. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. 10 years ago, I was a different person. I was 17, buzzing with the kind of nervous energy that only a high school senior on the cusp of everything can possess. My world was my bedroom, plastered with posters of bands you've never heard of and pennants from a university 1,000 miles away. That university wasn't just a school, it was an escape hatch. It represented a life of ivy-covered buildings, crisp autumns, and most importantly, distance. It was my dream, the one I had nurtured since I was a freshman, the one that got me through mind-numbing calculus classes and endless nights studying for the SATs. The journalism program was one of the best in the country, and I could already picture myself, a determined young reporter, chasing down stories on a bustling, vibrant campus. My parents, Martha and George, were publicly supportive, in the way parents are when their child is aiming for something prestigious. They would boast to their friends at neighborhood barbecues, "Oh, Pamela is applying to some wonderful schools out of state. We're so proud." But behind closed doors, their pride was laced with a thick, cloying anxiety. My mother, Martha, a retired nurse, was a professional worrier. She saw danger in every shadow and a potential catastrophe in every choice that deviated from the familiar. "Are you sure you want to be so far away, sweetie?" she'd ask, her brow furrowed as she folded laundry, a task she performed with surgical precision. "What if you get sick? Who will take care of you?" My father, George, a real estate agent whose entire career was built on the concept of location, 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 had a more pragmatic, yet equally suffocating approach. "There's a perfectly good state university just 40 minutes from here, Pam," he would say, peering over his newspaper. "You could live at home, save a fortune. Think of the debt you'd avoid." To him, life was a series of calculated risks and returns, and moving 1,000 miles away for an undergraduate degree was, in his ledger, a catastrophic miscalculation. They spoke of safety and finances, but I heard the unspoken words beneath: "Don't leave us. Stay where we can see you. Stay where you belong." Their concern felt like a weighted blanket, comforting at first, but soon becoming heavy and restrictive. I tried to explain that this was what I needed, that my desire to leave wasn't a rejection of them, but an embrace of my own future. I wanted to see a different part of the country, to meet people who didn't know my parents, to build an identity that was solely mine. They would nod and smile, but their eyes held a quiet panic that I chose to ignore. I was convinced that once the acceptance letter arrived, their fears would be replaced by undeniable pride. They would have to let me go. They would have to be happy for me. My application was, in my humble opinion, a work of art. My grades were impeccable, my extracurriculars were robust, and my personal essay was a heartfelt piece about how the local town newspaper had ignited my passion for telling the stories of ordinary people. I poured every ounce of my 17-year-old soul into it. My cousin Susan, who was a couple of years older and already at art school, read it over for me. "Pam, this is amazing," she'd said. "They'd be crazy not to take you." Her confidence was a much-needed antidote to my parents' pervasive anxiety. The waiting period was excruciating. Every day I'd race home from school, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the mailbox. I'd hold my breath as I sorted through the bills and junk mail, searching for a thick envelope bearing the university's crest. My parents watched this daily ritual with a kind of pained patience. "It'll come when it comes, honey," my dad would say, not looking up from the TV. "Don't get your hopes up too high. It's an incredibly competitive school." It was his new mantra, a constant, gentle chipping away at my confidence. Looking back, I see now it wasn't just a warning, it was groundwork. They were laying the foundation for my failure. I spent hours on the university's online student forums, connecting with other anxious applicants. We traded stats and speculated about decision dates. It was a community of shared hope, a bubble of excitement that felt a world away. Why from the quiet, stifling atmosphere of my house? I made a few online friends, kids from California and Texas and Florida, all of us bound by this one singular dream. We promised to meet up for coffee on campus that fall, a promise that felt as real and tangible as the keyboard under my fingers. The days turned into weeks. Other letters began to arrive. I was accepted into the local state university, of course. My parents celebrated with a special dinner, my dad calling it a fantastic safety net, and my mom looking visibly relieved for the first time in months. "Isn't that wonderful, Pam?" she beamed. "You're all set, no more stress." It felt less like a celebration of an achievement and more like a celebration of a potential crisis averted. I smiled and thanked them, but the smaller, thinner envelope felt like a consolation prize for a race I hadn't even finished running yet. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, the letter I'd been waiting for was finally there. Or rather, a letter. It wasn't the thick, celebratory package I had envisioned. It was a standard, business-sized envelope. My stomach plummeted. I knew, even before I tore it open with trembling fingers, what it would say. The paper inside was crisp, the letterhead formal and impersonal. The words swam before my eyes, but a few phrases stood out with brutal clarity. "Regret to inform you, a remarkable pool of applicants. Wish you the best in your future endeavors." The world seemed to shrink and all the sound drained away. It was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. I had been so sure, so confident. I had let myself dream so vividly that the reality of this rejection felt like a personal and profound failure. I stumbled into the house, the letter clutched in my hand like a death sentence. My mom was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. She turned, saw my face, and her expression immediately softened into one of pity and concern. "Oh, sweetie," she said, rushing over to wrap me in her arms. "What is it?" I couldn't speak, I just handed her the letter. She read it, her lips tightening into a thin line. She pulled me into a hug, stroking my hair. "I am so sorry, Pam. I know how much you wanted this." My dad came in a few minutes later, and the scene repeated itself. He put a hand on my shoulder, his voice low and somber. "It's their loss, kiddo. They don't know what they're missing." Their sympathy was a balm, but it was also a cage. They were so good at it, their performance so seamless. They offered me ice cream. They told me the state university was a better fit anyway. They said everything happens for a reason. They were comforting the victim of a crime they themselves had committed. That night, I cried myself to sleep, mourning the loss of a future I never knew had been stolen from me. I mourned the one that got away, never suspecting that it hadn't gotten away at all. It had been captured and hidden, just out of my reach, by the very people who were now patting my back and telling me it would all be okay. The weeks following the rejection were a blur of forced smiles and hollow reassurances. My parents treated me with a delicate, kid-glove care that felt suffocating. They orchestrated my grief, guiding it toward a conclusion they had predetermined long ago. The dream was dead. Long live the practical, sensible alternative. Their comfort was a masterclass in manipulation, a carefully calculated performance designed to soothe me into submission. Every word, every gesture, was a thread in the net they were weaving around me. My mother, Martha, took the lead. She would sit on the edge of my bed at night, her expression a perfect blend of maternal love and sorrow. "You know, honey," she'd say, her voice soft as velvet, "maybe this is a blessing in disguise. That city is so big and overwhelming. I would have worried about you every single second." She painted my dream as a nightmare I had narrowly escaped, a dangerous world full of unknown threats from which she and my father had inadvertently saved me. She made staying feel like a victory, a smart choice, rather than a surrender. She would bring me tea and my favorite cookies, small comforts that felt like rewards for accepting my fate. My father, George, played his part with a more logical, business-like approach. He sat me down at the kitchen table one Saturday with a spreadsheet. On one side, he listed the astronomical costs of my dream university, tuition, room and board, out-of-state fees, travel expenses. On the other, he detailed the manageable costs of the local state university, highlighting the massive savings of living at home. "Look at these numbers, Pamela," he said, tapping a ridiculously large figure with his pen. "You would have been saddled with this debt for 30 years. 30 years? You've dodged a financial bullet. You're starting your adult life on solid ground." He framed the situation not as a personal failure, but as a financial triumph. He was the shrewd businessman, and I was the client he had just saved from a disastrous investment. They worked in perfect harmony, a tag team of loving manipulation. Mom handled the emotional front, Dad handled the practical. Together, they dismantled my dream brick by brick and built a new, smaller, safer one in its place. And I, heartbroken and 17, bought into it completely. How could I not? They were my parents. They loved me. Their concern felt genuine, their logic unassailable. I started to believe them. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe I wasn't cut out for that life. Maybe I had been naive and foolish to think I could make it so far from home. My friends tried to be supportive, but they couldn't understand. They were all excitedly planning their dorm room decor and talking about their new roommates. I felt like a ghost at my own graduation party, smiling and accepting congratulations for getting into the state university while my heart ached for what could have been. The online friends I had made on the university forum sent me messages of condolence. Then slowly, one by one, their excited chatter about orientation week and class schedules faded from my screen. I was no longer part of their world. That summer, instead of packing for a new life 1,000 miles away, I was picking out new bedding for my childhood bedroom. My parents helped me redecorate, a project that was symbolic of my new reality. We painted the walls a soothing, neutral beige, replacing the vibrant colors of my adolescence. The university pennants came down, packed away in a box in the attic. "Time for a more grown-up look," my mom said cheerfully, as she folded the felt triangle emblazoned with the logo of the school that had rejected me. It felt like they were erasing the old me, the ambitious dreamer, and replacing her with a more sensible, stay-at-home daughter. I enrolled at the local university, majoring in English because it felt like the closest thing to journalism they offered. The campus was fine. The classes were fine. Everything was just fine. It was a life painted in shades of beige, just like my new bedroom walls. I commuted from home, my father insisting it was the only financially responsible choice. My days were structured and predictable. I'd go to class, come home, have dinner with my parents, do my homework, and go to bed. My world, which had once felt expansive and full of possibilities, had shrunk to the size of our town. My parents reveled in it. They loved having me home. I was there for every family dinner, every holiday, every minor household event. "Isn't this nice?" my mom would say constantly. "I don't know what we would have done if you had moved so far away." They praised my good grades, my responsible choices, my maturity. They were so proud of the person I had become, never realizing they had manufactured her. I was their perfect daughter, compliant and close by, my wings neatly clipped. Over the next few years, I settled into a comfortable complacency. The sharp pain of the rejection dulled into a faint, persistent ache. It became a part of my personal mythology, the story I told myself about my limitations. I'm just not the kind of person who takes big risks. I'm a homebody. It's better this way. I finished my degree, then got a master's in library science from the same university. It felt like a natural progression, a quiet, stable career for a quiet, stable person. When a librarian position opened up at the town's public library, it seemed like fate. My parents were thrilled. My father, the real estate agent, even pointed out the property value of our home. "Having a respectable, stable daughter living at home is a great selling point," he joked. It wasn't really a joke. I was 25 when I finally moved out, and even then, only to an apartment complex 10 minutes away. My parents helped me find it. My father negotiated the lease. My mother helped me decorate. They were still deeply enmeshed in every aspect of my life. I had friends, I dated a little, but nothing ever felt quite real. It was as if I was living a life that belonged to someone else, a tamer, less interesting version of the woman I was supposed to be. The dream of that other life, the one with the ivy-covered walls and the bustling campus, would sometimes surface in my dreams, a ghostly reminder of a path not taken. I would wake up with a feeling of profound loss, a feeling I couldn't quite name. It was the phantom limb of a stolen future. And my parents, the architects of my small, safe world, would call me every morning, just to check in, their voices full of a love that was as deep and genuine as it was poisonously controlling. Their calculated comfort had worked perfectly. I was safe, I was secure, and I was trapped. Life continued on its steady, predictable track for another few years. I found a certain rhythm in my work at the library, a quiet satisfaction in the order of the Dewey Decimal System and the hushed reverence of the archives. It was a life of contained stories, both in the books I shelved and in the past I had locked away. The sharp edges of my disappointment had been worn smooth by time, leaving only a polished stone of regret I carried in my pocket. At 28, I was settled. It wasn't the life I had once dreamed of, but it was a life nonetheless. The catalyst for change came not with a bang, but with a somber phone call. My great-aunt Carol, my grandmother's sister, passed away at the age of 92. She had been a vibrant, fiercely independent woman who had lived in the same house 60 miles away for the last 70 years of her life. She never had children of her own, and my mom was her closest living relative and the executor of her estate. The task of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions fell to the family. My parents, citing their age and the emotional toll, asked if my cousin Susan and I could handle the initial clearing out. Susan and I had always been close, more like sisters than cousins. She was a graphic designer living in the city, her life a vibrant splash of color compared to my muted tones. We agreed to spend a weekend at Aunt Carol's house, armed with cardboard boxes and a sense of solemn duty. Aunt Carol's house was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slanting through the floral curtains. Every surface was covered in knickknacks, photographs, and decades of memories. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, lavender, and time itself. As a librarian, I felt a strange sense of reverence. It was a personal archive of a life well lived. We started in the attic, the repository of the oldest and most forgotten things. It was hot and cramped, filled with steamer trunks, old furniture shrouded in white sheets like ghosts, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. We worked for hours, sorting things into piles: keep, donate, trash. We found my grandmother's wedding dress, my mother's childhood report cards, and a box of letters my great-uncle had sent to Carol from the war. It was an emotional and exhausting archaeological dig into our own family history. Late on Saturday afternoon, covered in dust and sweat, we stumbled upon a large wooden chest tucked away in a dark corner. It was full of what looked like my mother's old high school and college memorabilia: yearbooks, track and field ribbons, a dried corsage. "Looks like Grandma sent this stuff to Carol for safekeeping when they moved," Susan commented, wiping her brow. At the bottom of the chest, beneath a stack of photo albums, was a shoebox labeled Pamela Important. My heart gave a little flutter. I didn't remember ever giving anything to Aunt Carol for safekeeping. Curiosity piqued, I lifted the lid. Inside were my baby shoes, a lock of my hair from my first haircut, and a handful of my childhood drawings. It was a small collection of my own history, curated by my mother. And underneath it all, lying flat on the bottom, were 2 envelopes. The first one was instantly recognizable. It was the thin, business-sized envelope from my dream university, the one that had delivered the devastating news a decade ago. My name and address were neatly typed on the front. A wave of the old, familiar sadness washed over me. I couldn't imagine why my mom would have saved this painful reminder, let alone stored it here. But it was the second envelope, tucked just behind the first, that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was larger, thicker, and made of a heavy, creamy cardstock. In the top left corner was the university's crest, embossed in deep blue ink. It was the thick envelope. The one I had dreamed of, the one I had watched for every single day. The one that was supposed to change my life. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was addressed to me at my parents' house. The postmark was dated April 5th, 10 years ago, a full week before the date on the rejection letter I had received. The envelope wasn't sealed. The flap was tucked in, as if someone had opened it, read its contents, and then carefully closed it again. "What is it?" Susan asked, seeing the color drain from my face. I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was holding. It felt like a historical artifact from an alternate timeline, a timeline where my life had taken a completely different course. With a sense of dread and a surreal feeling of unreality, I pulled out the contents. Inside was a professionally printed folder. And on the very first page, in bold, celebratory letters, were the words I had longed to see for a decade. "Congratulations! It is with great pleasure that we offer you, Pamela, a place in the incoming freshman class." I sank to the floor of the dusty attic, the letter clutched in my hand. The world tilted on its axis. Every sound was muffled as if I were underwater. I read the words over and over again. An acceptance. A welcome to the journalism program. Tales about scholarships I had been awarded, information about orientation, a personal note from the dean. It wasn't just an acceptance, it was an enthusiastic one. They had wanted me. They had chosen me. The rejection letter I had received was a lie. This was the truth. A truth that had been buried in a dusty box in a dead woman's attic for 10 years. Pamela, what's wrong?" Susan was kneeling in front of me, her voice filled with alarm. I couldn't look at her. I just held out the two letters, the thick, joyful acceptance and the thin, cruel rejection. She took them, her eyes darting between the two. She saw the different postmarks, the different tones, the impossible contradiction they represented. Her face shifted from confusion to dawning horror. "Oh my God," she whispered, looking from the letters to me. "Pam, how is this possible?" But I knew. In that gut-wrenching moment, a decade of confusing memories, of veiled comments and suffocating concerns suddenly snapped into focus. My parents' relief, their insistence it was for the best. Their carefully orchestrated comfort. It hadn't been comfort. It had been a cover-up. They hadn't helped me grieve a loss, they had manufactured it. They hadn't just watched my dream die. They had actively, deliberately, and methodically killed it. The echo I heard in that empty house wasn't just the memory of my gray tant. It was the ghost of the life I was supposed to live. The drive home from Aunt Carol's house was silent. Susan drove, occasionally glancing at me with worried eyes, while I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the monotonous landscape of the highway. The two letters were in my lap, one thick, one thin, feeling as heavy as gravestones. My mind was a whirlwind of rage, betrayal, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. This wasn't the grief of a 17-year-old who failed. It was the grief of a 28-year-old who had just discovered her entire adult life was built on a foundation of deceit. Every small memory from that spring 10 years ago was replaying in my head, now cast in a sinister new light. My father's constant reminders about the school's competitiveness. My mother's anxieties about me moving so far away. The way they rushed to comfort me, their words of sympathy so ready, so rehearsed. They weren't just parents worried about their daughter, they were co-conspirators managing the fallout of their own scheme. But how could they have done it? The question hammered at me. It wasn't enough to know that they had lied. I needed to understand the mechanics of the betrayal, the anatomy of the lie itself. When I got back to my apartment, I called my boss at the library, David, and told him I needed to take a few personal days. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He was immediately concerned but didn't press for details, simply saying, "Of course, Pamela, take all the time you need." I spent the next 48 hours in a fugue state, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning anger. I spread the two letters out on my dining room table, a museum exhibit of my own sabotage. My librarian instincts took over. I was no longer a victim, I was a researcher, and this was the most important investigation of my life. First, the acceptance letter. It was real, no doubt about it. The paper quality, the embossed seal, the specific details about the scholarship, it was all authentic. I went to the university's website and looked up their admissions FAQ. They stated that all decision letters were mailed on the same day. The postmark on my acceptance was April 5th. This was the real one. Next, the rejection letter. This was the piece that required scrutiny. The postmark was April 12th, a full week later. Why would a rejection be sent a week after an acceptance? It made no sense. I examined the letterhead. Compared to the official documents in the acceptance package, it was slightly off. The crest was a little less sharp, the font a close but not perfect match. To a devastated teenager, it would have been unnoticeable. To a 28-year-old librarian with a decade of experience handling documents, it was a forgery. A very, very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Where would they have gotten it? The answer clicked into place with sickening clarity. My father, George, he was a real estate agent, but his office was a marvel of modern technology. He had high-end printers, scanners, different types of paper stock for printing glossy brochures. He was meticulous, detail-oriented. He could have easily scanned the letterhead from a piece of university promotional mail, typed up the rejection text himself, and printed a nearly flawless fake. It was both diabolically clever and monstrously cruel. The timeline became clear. The real acceptance letter arrived on or around April 5th. My parents, likely my mother who was home during the day, intercepted it from the mailbox. They opened it, saw the life I ha. Chosen for myself pulling me 1,000 miles away, and they panicked. Their love for me, a possessive, controlling thing I had mistaken for simple concern, drove them to an unthinkable act. They hid the real letter. Then my father forged the rejection. They waited a week where I was anxiously checking the mail every day, my hope dwindling, and then they planted the fake letter for me to find. The week-long delay was a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. It made the final rejection feel more inevitable, more final. They hadn't just lied, they had directed a play, and I was the unwitting lead actor. I started digging deeper, my apartment turning into a war room. I pulled out old photo albums and journals from that year. There was a photo from my high school graduation. I was standing between my parents, a strained smile on my face. They were beaming, clutching my arms, they looked so proud. The caption my mom had written underneath was, "So proud of our sensible girl?" Sensible. Not brilliant, not ambitious. Sensible. It was the highest compliment in their vocabulary. I called Susan. I needed a second opinion, a sanity check. I laid out my theory step by step, my voice cold and methodical. "Am I crazy?" I asked when I finished. "Is this plausible?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No, Pam, you're not crazy," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and fury. "You're a detective, and I think you've solved the case. It makes a horrible, perfect kind of sense." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I remembered something about my great-aunt Carol. My mother used to send her packages of family memorabilia every few years. "Carol loves to have these things," she'd say. "It makes her feel connected." But Carol's memory had been failing in her last years. My mother must have hidden the letters in that box, planning to retrieve them later, or perhaps just wanting them out of the house. But then, as time went on, maybe she forgot exactly where they were, or maybe she sent the box to Carol's by mistake during a clear-out, never imagining I would be the one to find it a decade later. It was a loose end, a single sloppy mistake in an otherwise perfectly executed plan. The full weight of their deception crashed down on me. It wasn't just about a university. They had systematically undermined my confidence, manipulated my emotions, and altered the entire trajectory of my life to suit their own needs. They had kept me small to keep me close. The quiet, predictable life I was living wasn't one I had chosen. It was a sentence I had been serving for a crime I didn't commit. The grief I felt earlier was now eclipsed by a white-hot, clarifying rage. It wasn't wild or chaotic. It was focused. It was the anger of a librarian who had just found the most important truth of her life hidden in the footnotes. I looked at the 2 letters on my table. They had written the first chapter of my adult life. Now, it was my turn to write the rest. The investigation was over. The planning was about to begin. The rage that had settled in my bones was a cold, hard thing. It didn't burn, it focused. For 3 days, I barely slept. I sat in my quiet apartment, the 2 letters laid out before me like a declaration of war, and I began to formulate a plan. A simple, angry confrontation wouldn't be enough. Yelling and crying would allow them to dismiss me as hysterical or overly emotional. They would retreat into their well-practiced roles of concerned parents dealing with an overwrought child. No, what they did was calculated, deliberate, and theatrical. My response had to be the same. They had built a stage and directed a decade-long play about my life. I was going to write the final act. My profession gave me the tools I needed. As a librarian and archivist in training under David, I understood the power of evidence, of documentation, of presenting an undeniable, meticulously organized truth. My revenge wouldn't be about shouting. It would be about revealing. I would dismantle their narrative with the quiet, irrefutable power of facts. The centerpiece of their social life was their annual Proud Parents dinner party. It was an event my father, George, had conceived of years ago. Every spring, they would invite their closest friends, 3 other couples whose children had grown up with me, for an evening of good food, expensive wine, and mutual back-patting about their children's successes. It was the height of their suburban vanity, a performance of perfect parenting for their most important audience. This year's dinner was scheduled for Saturday night, just 4 days away. It was the perfect stage. My first step was to gather my cast and props. I called Susan and David and told them I needed their help. Susan, with her graphic design skills, was my visual artist. David, the head archivist, was my consultant on presentation and impact. I met them at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, laying out the entire story and my plan. I want to create a presentation, I explained, my voice steady. A historical record of their lie. I want to show their friends, the people whose opinions they value more than anything, exactly who they are. David nodded slowly, his archivist's mind immediately grasping the concept. A curated exhibit, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. You present the artifacts and let them tell the story. Powerful. Susan's eyes lit up with a creative, vengeful fire. I can make it look incredible, Pam, professional, like something you'd see in a museum. What do you need? For the next 3 days, we worked tirelessly. Susan took high-resolution scans of the acceptance letter, the forged rejection letter, and the envelopes, highlighting the mismatched fonts, the different postmarks, the subtle discrepancies. She created a series of beautiful, damning presentation boards, the kind you'd see at a corporate meeting. Each board was a chapter in the story of their deceit. Meanwhile, I worked with David to craft the narrative. He helped me structure my speech, advising me to stay calm, factual, and detached. Let the evidence be the source of the emotion, he coached. Your calmness will be more chilling than any tears. He was right. My composure would be the ultimate indictment of their manufactured drama. I also did some digital digging. I went back through my old emails from 10 years ago and found the exchanges with my online friends from the university forum. I took screenshots of our excited plans to meet on campus and their later messages of condolence. I found the email from the local state university confirming my enrollment. Each piece was another nail in the coffin of their lie. The final and most crucial part of the plan involved the university itself. This was the riskiest move, but it was essential. I called the admissions office of my dream university. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited on hold. When I finally got through to a representative, I explained that I was trying to locate a record of my application from 10 years prior for my personal records. I gave her my name and date of birth. After a few minutes of typing, she came back on the line. Yes, Pamela, I have your file right here, she said cheerfully. Looks like you were accepted into the journalism program with a dean's scholarship, but the records show you declined the offer. My breath hitched. Declined? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How did I decline? Let's see, she said. It says we received a letter from you, postmarked April 20th of that year, formally declining the offer of admission. Do you need a copy of that? A new wave of cold fury washed over me. Of course, They couldn't just destroy the acceptance letter. The university would have followed up, wondering why they hadn't heard from me. So my parents had taken the final step. They had forged a second letter, this time in my name, killing my dream with a stroke of a pen that wasn't even mine. They didn't just hide the truth, they put words in my mouth. "Yes," I said, my voice now hard as steel. "Please, I'd like a copy of that letter sent to my email address immediately." Within an hour, it was in my inbox. A scanned PDF of a neatly typed letter, signed with a forgery of my own 17-year-old signature. It was the final piece of evidence. The smoking gun, as David called it. Susan added it to a final, devastating presentation board titled The Forgery. By Friday evening, everything was ready. We had a portfolio of beautifully designed, horrifyingly clear evidence. I had rehearsed my speech until the words were second nature, stripped of all emotion except a cold, hard clarity. I felt a strange sense of calm. I was a librarian who had spent a decade living in a fiction section. On Saturday night, I was going to move myself, permanently, into nonfiction. I laid out a simple, professional-looking dress for the evening, the kind of outfit a successful, well-adjusted woman would wear. A woman who was in complete control of her own story. Saturday evening arrived with a placid suburban beauty that felt like a mockery. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood. I parked my car down the street and walked to their house, carrying a large, elegant black portfolio under my arm. From the outside, the house looked exactly as it always had. Warm, welcoming, a picture of domestic tranquility. Tonight, I was going to shatter that picture forever. I rang the doorbell and my mother opened it, her face breaking into a wide, beaming smile. "Pamela, sweetie, you're here. Come in, come in." She was wearing a new dress, and the house smelled of roasted chicken and my father's expensive aftershave. The scene was perfectly set for their annual performance. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice even. I stepped inside, and she immediately noticed the portfolio. "What's that you've got there, honey? A project from work?" she asked, her curiosity casual. "Something like that," I replied. "It's a presentation I've been working on. I was hoping I could share it with everyone after dinner." My father came into the hall, a glass of wine in his hand. "A presentation? That's my girl, always working hard," he boomed, patting my shoulder. "Of course, we'd love to see it." He was so proud, so blissfully unaware. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Their friends were already there, the Millers, the Clarks, and the Davidsons. They were the people who had watched me grow up, who had cooed over my baby pictures and attended my high school plays. They greeted me with warm hugs and questions about the library. I smiled, made small talk, and accepted a glass of water. I needed a clear head. Dinner was a masterclass in parental boasting. My father talked about the booming real estate market. Mrs. Miller talked about her son's promotion at his law firm. Mr. Davidson bragged about his daughter's acceptance into a prestigious graduate program. My parents, not to be outdone, sang my praises. "Pamela is doing so wonderfully at the library," my mother said to the table. "She's so dedicated. We're just so glad she chose a career that allowed her to stay close to home." It's been such a blessing. I just smiled and ate my chicken, letting them dig their own graves. Every word of praise, every proud smile, was another shovel full of dirt. After dessert was served and coffee was poured, my father clapped his hands together. "All right, everyone. Pamela has a presentation she wants to share with us. The floor is yours, Pam." A hush fell over the room. They all looked at me with indulgent smiles, expecting a quaint little slideshow about a new archiving system at the library. I stood up and walked to the front of the living room, setting up a small easel I had brought with me. I placed the portfolio on it. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice clear and calm. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of their friends before finally letting my gaze settle on my parents. "This project is something I've been working on for the last week, but in reality, it's a story that's been 10 years in the making. It's a story about a letter, or rather, several letters." I opened the portfolio and placed the first presentation board on the easel. It was a beautiful collage Susan had designed, showing pictures of me as a hopeful 17-year-old, surrounded by memorabilia from my dream university. The title at the top read, The Dream. 10 years ago, I began, I had a dream of attending a university 1,000 miles from here. I poured everything I had into my application, and I was confident. I then placed the second board on the easel. It showed a side-by-side comparison of the two envelopes, the thick one and the thin one. I waited for months for a thick envelope in the mail, but it never came. Instead, on April 13th, I received this. I pointed to the thin envelope. A rejection. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. My father's smile had frozen on his face. I was heartbroken, I continued, my voice betraying no emotion. But my parents were wonderful. They comforted me. They told me it was a blessing in disguise, that I had dodged a financial bullet, that I was better off here, close to home. I looked directly at them. You were so convincing. I put up the third board. It was a high-resolution scan of the acceptance letter, the word congratulations, magnified in a circle. Imagine my surprise when, last weekend, while clearing out Great-Aunt Carol's attic, I found this, the real letter, the one that arrived on April 5th, the one that told me I had been accepted, with a scholarship. A collective gasp went through the room. The Millers and the Clarks were staring at my parents, their mouths agape. My mother had gone pale as a sheet. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. But how could this be? I asked the room, my tone purely rhetorical. I moved to the next board, which displayed the forged rejection letter next to the university's official letterhead, the discrepancies in the font and seal highlighted in red. Because the rejection letter I received was a fake, a very well-made forgery. My father tried to speak. Pamela, this is ridiculous. Is it? I asked, my voice cutting through his. I didn't wait for an answer. I put up the final, most damning board. It showed a copy of the letter they had sent to the university, the one declining the offer of admission, with my forged signature magnified. The title of the board was The Forgery. You couldn't just hide the acceptance, I stated, my voice like ice. You had to make sure the university thought I had rejected them, so you wrote this letter and you forged my signature. You didn't just lie to me, you lied as me, you stole my voice, you stole my future. Silence, T. The air in the room was thick with horror and disbelief. Their friends were staring at my parents, no longer with confusion, but with dawning comprehension and judgment. The performance was over. The masks were off. I turned to my parents. My mother was openly weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face. My father was white-knuckling his wine glass, his jaw clenched. For 10 years, I said, my voice finally cracking, but with rage, not sadness, I have lived the small, sensible life you designed for me. I believed I wasn't good enough. I believed I had failed, but I didn't fail. You failed me. You were so afraid of letting me go that you crippled me instead. You chose your comfort over my happiness, your peace of mind over my potential. That acceptance letter was my future. And this, I said, gesturing to the presentation, this is my reply. The one you never let me send. I looked at their friends, at these people whose approval my parents so desperately craved. I just thought you should all know who you've been having dinner with all these years. With that, I packed up my portfolio, turned my back on the wreckage of their lives, and walked out the door without a second glance. The sound of my mother's sobbing followed me out into the cool night air. Leaving my parents' house that night felt like walking out of a tomb. The air outside was fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of lies I had left behind. I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I went to a small park overlooking the town and just sat on a bench, the black portfolio resting beside me. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. I just felt empty. It was the emptiness that comes after a storm, the quiet stillness after a great uprooting. The person I had been for the last decade, the sensible, quiet, stay-at-home daughter, had died in that living room. Now, I had to figure out who was born in her place. The fallout was immediate and spectacular, everything I had planned for and more. Susan called me the next morning. A Apparently, Mrs. Miller had called her mother in a state of shock the night before. The dinner party had imploded the moment I walked out. The guests had left almost immediately, stammering awkward goodbyes, unable to look my parents in the eye. The carefully constructed social standing my parents had spent their lives building had crumbled in the space of 15 minutes. My phone was inundated with texts and missed calls from my parents. First came the furious, indignant messages from my father, accusing me of humiliating them, of being ungrateful and cruel. Then came the desperate, pleading voicemails from my mother, sobbing apologies mixed with justifications about how they had only done it because they loved me so much and couldn't bear the thought of me leaving. I listened to none of them in full. I blocked their numbers. For the first time in my life, I was enforcing a boundary. The silence was liberating. Word travels fast in a small town. Within a week, the story was everywhere, whispered in the grocery store aisles and over coffee at the local diner. My parents became social pariahs. The friends they had so desperately wanted to impress now crossed the street to avoid them. My father's real estate business took a significant hit. People, it turned out, were hesitant to do business with a man known for his elaborate deceptions. My mother stopped going to her weekly book club. They had built their entire world on a foundation of appearances, and I had shown everyone what lay beneath the floorboards. They were trapped in the very town they had forced me to stay in, but now it was a prison of their own making. While their world was shrinking, mine was finally beginning to open up. The emptiness I had felt began to fill with something new, possibility. I went back to work at the library, and David greeted me with a quiet, knowing look of respect. "You did the right thing," was all he said, and it was enough. Working amongst the books, the tangible records of history and stories, felt different now. I was no longer just a custodian of other people's narratives, I was actively writing my own. I took the original acceptance letter and the scholarship offer and framed them. I hung them on the wall of my apartment, not as a painful reminder of what I had lost, but as a compass pointing toward the future. It was proof of my potential, a validation that had been denied to me for a decade. 3 months after the confrontation, I made a decision. I walked into David's office and gave my 2 weeks' notice. He wasn't surprised. "Where are you going?" he asked with a smile. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly, "but it's somewhere else." I sold most of my furniture, packed my books and clothes into my car, and left my hometown without a single goodbye to my parents. I didn't have a grand plan. For the first time, I didn't need one. My plan was simply to be free. I drove for 2 days and ended up in a new city, the kind of vibrant, bustling place I had once dreamed of. I got a small apartment and a temporary job at a university library to pay the bills. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Every day was a choice that was entirely my own. I took a creative writing class at the local community college. I started a blog writing personal essays about my experiences, about rediscovering oneself after a decade of living a lie. To my astonishment, people started reading it. My voice, the one that had been silenced and forged, was finally being heard. About a year after I left, I received a letter, forwarded from my old apartment. It was from my cousin Susan. Tucked inside was a newspaper clipping from my hometown paper. It was an announcement that my parents had sold their house and were moving to a retirement community in another state. Their reign in the town was officially over. Susan wrote that they had tried to get my new address from her, but she had refused to give it to them. I felt a pang of something, not sadness, but a distant, clinical pity for the 2 people who had broken their own lives in their attempt to control mine. They had wanted to keep me in a cage, but they had only succeeded in building one for themselves. Today, I am 30. My life is nothing like the one they planned for me, and for that, I am eternally grateful. I never became a journalist in the traditional sense, but I became a storyteller, my own storyteller. I am still a librarian, but now I work in a vast university archive, surrounded by the authentic, messy, wonderful truth of history. My life isn't perfect or neat, but it is mine. Every decision, every mistake, every triumph belongs to me. I rewrote my own history, and the final chapter is one I could have never imagined in that quiet, Beige bedroom 10 years ago. Freedom.